pleased to have two contributors joined us today to talk specifically about their work. So Jan Micheson is going to speak to us first. For those of you who have experienced how to argue better, I know a number of practitioners in the room have been on training. Well, if you enjoyed How to Argue Better, then you can thank Jan for that. Jan is a teacher, she's a practice innovator, worked for 13 years as a health visitor in Northumberland before joining OnePlusOne over 10 years ago. Her work is mainly focused on family, couple relationships, and has led a number of successful programs at OnePlusOne and also as an associate of OnePlusOne. She's also sort of worked with us in Hartlepool. We've been really pleased that Jan came up and worked with us at the back end of last year to think about this seminar and this conference today, and to think about what kind of resources that might be useful for practitioners working on the front line. So the goodie bag that you've got, a lot of the resources in there are based on the work that Jan has produced over the years. So I'm delighted that she's here with us today to share some of that background evidence. Following Jan, we'll then have Marie Huscroft, who's joined us from Newcastle, who has been operating as a health visitor and as a relationship navigator, actually doing the doing. So she will talk to us about it can be done, and this is how I did it in my role. So I'll introduce Jan.
Thank you, Jane. That very warm welcome, and good morning, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here in Hartlepool. As Jane said, I came in December, and I'm a real fan of the work that you're doing here at Healthy Relationships Hartlepool. I think it's really inspiring to see that relationships has become such a big part of your agenda. So thank you for inviting me. I'm going to talk about my favourite subject, which is what happens in the transition to parenthood, what happens to couple relationships, and really importantly, what we on the front line can do. As Jane said, I was a health visitor for many years, and I always remember going along to a family where there was a mother who was quite distressed, and in talking to her, when I really got underneath what was the problem, she I'd gone to talk about baby not sleeping or whatever, and when we really got to talk to her, I began to realise that underneath this presenting problem was this issue of the relationship with a partner. And I think at that time, it was many years ago, I thought, God, I'm out of my depth here, I've got no idea what to do. This is way beyond my job. I'm not a relationship counsellor. And it was really from then that I began to be interested in this whole area of how frontline practice can respond, if you like, to those situations where it's clear that there is a couple relationship issue. I think that's what I was supposed to say on the next slide. So that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about why do parent relationships matter to children, and particularly to babies and children in the early years. And then I'm going to talk about what we can do to strengthen parent relationships. This slide is a slide that I use a lot because it's very clear that for many couples, having a baby is a real joy, and it brings a different dimension to their life, clearly. But we also know that for many parents, it presents real challenges, and particularly challenges to their relationship. And very often the arrival of a new baby is accompanied by a decline in relationship satisfaction. And as you can see from this chart, it starts around about when the baby's born for women and the mother, and yet for the father it starts a bit later than that, and the decline is steepest for women in the first 3 months, whereas men tend to be a little bit still okay about the relationship in the first 3 months. But then of course when things start to happen, and perhaps and there's a lack of intimacy, or they don't quite know what they're doing in this new role as a dad, or mom is clearly stressed and perhaps behaving in ways that are challenging, then we begin to see that the relationship satisfaction declines. And it's not really surprising when you think about it, because those of you who've had kids will know it's exhausting. You are fatigued from a lack of sleep. There's changes to your roles and identity as mum or dad or whatever combination of family there is. And all the time we're being bombarded with social media that tells us that it's fantastic films and clips on the television and social media that tell us that this is supposed to be all wonderful, and actually it doesn't feel like that. And so it's not surprising really that at this time the conflict within a relationship really starts to increase. And those of you who have been on How I'll Be Better will be aware of this diagram. And we use this diagram a lot because not only does it tell you that relationship quality clearly impacts babies and children. We know that from the extensive evidence that's out there now and has been emerging over the last 15 years. But that it's very much that relationship quality is very much related to 3 interrelated factors. So the first one being the stuff you bring to the relationship. So 2 partners in a relationship can bring very different things, and their values and expectations might be different. The way in which they've have been parenting themselves might be very different, and therefore the way they expect to parent could be at odds with each other. Whether or not the pregnancy was planned seems to impact on how the couple cope following the birth of the baby, and it's also something about their own childhood experiences. And clearly, we all understand the importance of attachment and how that can play out within a couple relationship. So all of those things are what we bring to this relationship, and at the same time we're probably undergoing one of the major stressors in life, a real transition. Any transition can be difficult for a couple relationship, but the first baby seems to be really significant. And within that time, if you add to that some of the things that we saw being played out here this morning in that truly inspiring drama, I was wowed by it. There's something about whether or not a baby or a small child might have an additional health or educational need. There's something about when unemployment or financial hardship plays into that, housing, etc. All those additional stresses that might come with, or clash, if you like, at the same time as having a baby. So you can see that immediately the couple relationship comes under pressure. And of course, you might have had some ways of communicating and adapting as a couple without children that then kind of don't work in that situation, and you need to adapt those communications. And it was clear from that drama that we saw that they hadn't been able to adapt. They talked about how close they were before, but the stress of Jess meant that they couldn't actually adapt and communicate in a different way. So all of that impacts on relationship quality. But the thing that really makes the difference is whether or not the couple feels supported. So whether dad supports mum or mum supports dad. And again, we could see in that drama that just wasn't happening. And that really had been, I think, one of the issues that had caused that family to fall apart. So support from a partner is one of the real protective factors in couple relationships when they have that first baby. Just something to be aware of when you're working with families is that pre-birth, couple negotiation and problem solving is at its absolute height, so they're great at it. 3 months post-birth, it's at its worst, so they've really lost the skill or the ability to be able to communicate and sort out their problems. So what does that mean? Well, that means that the couple relationship becomes distressed. And we know that at any time, about 1 in 5 couple relationships are in this state. But in the time following birth, then it can be 3 to 4 couples will experience distress in their relationship. And it has some devastating consequences, really, in terms of the impact of that on firstly the mother. So we know that antenatal stress caused by relationship distress can negatively impact birth experiences. We know that it's the biggest indicator of psychological distress in mothers. We know that couples where there's stress in their relationship, they're 3 times more likely to have any mood disorders, anxiety, and twice as likely to be dependent on or misuse substances in some way. Together with some physical health impacts, so we know that coronary heart disease is associated with stress and relationship distress, and healing times are much less for couples where they are not, when they're in that stressful situation. And altogether, the impact on the family can be severe. And when you've got parents in that state, what you find is that they become distressed parents become very distracted parents. And again, I think we saw that. They were so focused on themselves that they couldn't actually work together to help support their child. And so that's much of what you might be seeing in the families that you're working with. So relationship quality affects how parents can care for their children. Clearly, if you're very distracted and worried about other things, then that makes it more difficult. It's much more difficult to establish a consistent routine, and that's why you sometimes get issues with behaviour problems in children, because consistent routines have been absent, and they're absent because the parents are so focused on what's happening to them. Obviously, it's more difficult to provide a stimulating and emotionally secure environment for children, and there is very limited role modelling of healthy relationships, and that's what children need in terms of being able to, for them themselves, to be able to see how they have those more healthy relationships. Do I need to keep doing that? Okay, so it's not surprising then, with all that going on, that really the amount of arguing increases, particularly in these early times of having a baby. So just around the room, what do you think is the biggest cause of arguments in parents?
Who's the most tired?
Who's the most tired? Yeah. There's that who's got it worst competition going on, isn't there? Yeah. Ways of parenting, yeah, absolutely. So the ways in which you might bring up the baby or the child, yeah.
Money issues?
Money is the number one. How you spend it, how much you've got, bearing in mind that there might be some economic changes to the families. So yeah, money is number one.
Sex,
yeah, number 2. Too much of it, too little of it. However, yeah. And the in-laws, they're the other big thing. And who does what? The amount of housework and what you have to do and the jobs that have to be done are a big cause of arguments amongst parents. So they're the top 5. But what this is actually saying is, arguing is normal. We all argue. Me as much as anybody else. It's impossible not to when you're picking up your partner's socks off the bathroom floor for the 5th time this week. It's impossible not to be irritated by some of the things that your partner does or doesn't do. But it's actually, again, those of you who've been on the How to Argue Better course will be familiar with this slide. It's not actually the fact that you argue that's the issue. It's because that's how we resolve difference. It's actually how we argue that's so important. And if you can argue in ways that you seek resolution, you are prepared to compromise, to speak about it in a respectful manner. Someone used that word this morning, and it's so important in considering how you put across your own point of view, but also listen to the other person's point of view. That's what struck me about the drama this morning, that actually they weren't listening to each other's point of view at all. You can even have a discussion without finding the solution, if as long as that's with a level of humour and some affection within that. And Gottman does most of the work around this, and he found that, and it's on your little cards, and it says 5 to 1, and he did originally start 5 to 1, so for every negative thing you do or say to your partner, then you have to do 5 positive things. I tell you, that was impossible. I tried and I couldn't do it. But I do manage 2, and 2 is apparently fine. So you're okay as long as for every time you hurl abuse at him, you then stop and make up or do something positive, then you're okay. And children actually also respond much better when there is negativity. If they do then see positivity following that, then they're much better than children who live in an environment where all the time there's this destructive conflict. So very intense arguments, which we saw played out. Verbal or physical aggression clearly is worrying for children. The silent treatment, and I think this is really interesting. Most couples, on average, argue twice a week, followed by 2 hours of silence. I thought that was quite short. Which means that's 10 days a year that we're not speaking to our partner. Yeah, maybe I need to do something about that. And children do really less well where the argument is about them. So Jess, in the drama this morning, will do much less or will do worse if she hears her parents arguing about that. And there was a lot of it since Jess came along. She may not hear that overtly, but she will know that that is the tension within the family. And as I say, children do worse where this silent treatment is ongoing, because it threatens their very stability and safety. And of course, this is what Gottman says then happens. So when we're using those destructive conflict behaviours, eventually it's a downward spiral, and partners just end up in very different ways. And Dan and Ellie had done exactly that this morning. They had been using those conflict behaviours, and they had ended up on 2 different sides of the camp. And certainly, even if they're not physically removed from one another like that couple were, and actually in current economic climates, we're finding that an awful lot of families are staying together because they can't afford to move or to separate, and therefore they're emotionally very detached but not physically very detached. So using those behaviours, we're very sure that that's what drives the wedge and separates children, separates parents. I think you'll have seen this one before because you had Professor Harold last year at your conference, but I think we just can't say this often enough really about children who are exposed to that frequent, destructive, intense verbal hostility are much more likely to either internalise, so are sad, are troubled, or suffer anxiety and depression, or they become very physically aggressive and no doubt you've seen lots of examples of that and develop behaviour problems, and they do worse in school. And then of course that has a knock-on effect later on in life when they find adult relationships themselves quite difficult. Do you remember I said right at the beginning, what we bring, the stuff we bring to our relationship, we then play out again. Psychological well-being. And there is some association with employment. If you haven't learned the relational skills as a child, then sometimes they don't then play out in the workplace or other things, and that can give people later difficulties in work. And so I want to play this next video. I've seen it hundreds and hundreds of times, and it never fails to make me realise why we do this work and why it's so important. And these children who are going to talk to you now about what it feels like when their parents are arguing were totally unscripted when they talked about it.
Do I need to do something?
They say why they always argue about why one of them has more money than each other.
Does one want more money?
One wants more money, and the one who's got all the money doesn't give, and he gives a little bit to my grandma. Well, once they were shouting, and it was really loud, and our road is really long, and we were on one side having a walk, and then they started having an argument, and then they started shouting, and the people from the other side of the street could hear it. They were so loud. They were arguing in the kitchen, and I went in the front room and I sat on my dad's chair, and I was all curled up crying because I was upset. Sometimes it's not very good because they shout all day, and really I can't do my homework at school from St. Peter's on a cane, and I can't do anything because they're shouting. Well, I just feel inside like a frost is coming inside, and everything's going wrong in the world. And then when they make up, then it feels like it's all coming back, and all the summer's coming back. If you're all, of course, arguing all the time, the children might get it in their minds and start doing it at school and doing it to their friends, and then have no friends, and then when they grow up and get married, they might start doing it thinking, this is what my mum and dad did, why don't I do it? Or if, say, the mum and dad argue, they split up, the child would think, well, that's the first idea, I'll split up then with my husband when I'm older. So it's not good to have arguments all the time, but I think now and then to learn what you're doing and see what you shouldn't do. It makes me feel sad. It makes me feel worried. It feels really scary, like they're going to break up and one's going to go that side and one's going to go that side. So I don't know who to choose to go with, because I love both of them very much. So I don't really like them shouting. It scares me a lot. Crying like this.
Thank you. So really, you didn't need me to tell you all that evidence. It's quite clear what this does to children. And one thing we should say that is separation on its own is not, if parents separate, that's not the issue for children. For children, the issue is really how that separation is handled. And if it's very hostile and conflicted, then children do worse. Most children will recover from that time in their lives within about 2 years if parents can co-parent together and continue to have a relationship with the children. So I've painted a picture there of what it might be like in the early days of a relationship following the birth of a baby. And I think that's really where we come in. We can do something about stopping that decline in relationship satisfaction if we can pick up the signs in the early days. And you're actually in an ideal position, because we do know from the evidence that that parents are much more likely to turn to somebody who they already see or know in some other way than they are to go to a relationship counsellor, because they actually don't think they need a relationship counsellor, and also there are all sorts of barriers often to that. So it's very likely that someone will turn to you for that level of support. And if we can do something at that stage, then we can prevent that decline in the relationship satisfaction. There may be some, but what you're trying to do is stop the real erosion of relationship satisfaction. And as this slide shows, well, apart from convincing everybody not to have any children, which might not be the best thing for any of us, actually with a small amount of intervention for new parents, you can do something about them. So it is a hopeful picture. And strengthening a parent relationship is actually a really protective factor for kids. It really can stop some of these issues arising. And I suppose the question is, well, what can you do? Well, it is about being brave, and it is about having that conversation, that question that is around what's happening with you and with Dan and Ellie this morning. It's about creating some space and time to listen, and it actually doesn't have to be very much. We did some work that demonstrated that 10 minutes is enough to focus on a couple relationship to help them understand what might be going on. And what you've got in your packs are tools and resources that we've developed over the years, because I really felt for Marnie this morning. I thought, oh my goodness, she's so out of her depth, she doesn't know what to do, she hasn't got anything there that can help her. And so the resources and tools that you've got in your packs are designed to do just that, to help parents have some of the information and knowledge about what's happening to them. Because what you want to do is put the support in here so that they start to cope rather than descend into crisis. Because good communication and helping them, I mean, that's the whole thing about helping parents. If they're going to argue in ways that are much more constructive, and the children see them make up. That's really important. And we can help relational skills improve. And these are what you will see in your pack. And now I'm going to hand over to Marie, who's going to tell you about how she had those brave conversations and how she uses some of these resources in some case studies that she's been working in her role as a health visitor. Thank you.